morning. For those who have forgotten or who have forgotten their glasses, I'm not Barry Kidson, who most of you would have been expecting. For those who are visiting, I was meant to be on holiday and have been enjoying, but unfortunately Barry and his wife actually fell ill earlier in the week, and so alas, I've returned. I am quite a bit less wise than he is and only a few years younger, and so I'm glad to be back with you, and all we are simply doing is continuing through Deuteronomy. Not much work was required because we're just simply getting what would have been next week's sermon today. So for those who are visiting, we are doing what's called an expository series where we go through a particular book of the Bible. In this case, it's the book of Deuteronomy, the fifth book of what's called the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And we've been going through from obviously the beginning of chapter 1. We're here now about halfway through chapter 4. And I mentioned in last week's sermon, for those who were here, that there was one particular verse that I wasn't going to address last week, but instead actually tied into this week. And it comes from this passage that we've had read to us herein. And the focus this morning is particularly on verses 15 to 20. We had the broader context just read just simply so you would have context. But really the focus this morning is on verses 15 through 20. But the verse I mentioned last week that would be in connection with this week is that of verse 12. If you gaze your eyes there to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 12, you'll see the words, "Then Yahweh spoke to you from the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but you saw no form, only a voice." And so that will be tying into what we are seeing here this morning. Now, this particular turn on the part of the prophet Moses, at this particular juncture in his speech here in Deuteronomy chapter 4, is towards an exposition of particularly the first and second command. He is giving them what is the most consistent warning in the Old Testament and really throughout all the scriptures, which is the warnings against idolatry, the warnings against false worship, the worship of things which have been created in the world, as opposed to the one true creator God who made all things, who is above all things and by whom all things have been made and have their very being and existence in this world. It is the worship of things which are below as opposed to things which are above. It is the worship of the created as opposed to the creator. It's the worship of the finite as opposed to the infinite, so on and so forth. And the nature of idolatry in itself will be in focus over the coming weeks, particularly as we then move into Deuteronomy chapter 5, which is where Moses repeats the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. And so there'll be a quick cross-reference to that today. But what I'm wanting to focus on here is one of the important theological applications, as we would say, that transcend just this particular time period. And it's concerning that of images. It's concerning that of what we might call artwork. Now, I'll go on to define it a variety of terms. But what we are doing here this morning is focusing particularly on what this specific passage, verses 15 to 20, have to say with regards to informing us as to the place, either no place or any place or some place or all places, of imagery or of artwork. And we'll be focusing on that specifically this morning, and then we'll be back again in the same passage next week to focus on the purpose. So that is to say, this morning we're focusing on ontology, a word we've explained many times before, but the nature of what images or pictures or artwork is, and the nature of what idolatry is, at least in a very basic rudimentary sense. And then next week we'll be focusing on the form, or the function rather I should say, of artwork or of imagery, its purposefulness. And so you may have a lot of questions if you haven't heard a theological exposition on this subject in a while, or potentially even ever. And so some of those, or I suspect many of those, will actually then be answered next week. So it's important to listen to both parts. Don't come to particular conclusions after just one simple week. You have to listen to both weeks back to back. Why is this particular issue important? It's important for many, many reasons, but the one that we're wanting to focus on here this morning is with regards to the nature of what artwork is in substance. What is its definition? Is artwork, or is images in general, distinct from idolatry or idols, or are those the exact same thing? What kind of context does the scriptures paint for us? Of course, this is, as I mentioned in the introduction, a replete subject throughout the scriptures, and it is also the case with regards to church history. And much like many of the subjects throughout church history and throughout the history of God's church, there have been differences of opinion. There have been differences of opinion not only with regards to substance, so that is to say the nature of these things, but also particularly, and this is where the real differences lie, which is regards to their purpose or their function and what they are to be used for. There are a variance of opinions in the early church, so the first 5 centuries. There is a variance of opinions even in the medieval period, so from about the 6th century to the 16th century, roughly speaking. And then there is a variance of opinion even across the last 500 years. And the specifics of all that entails, as someone who teaches church history, I can tell you is an absolutely gargantuan subject. When we approach it in church history, we will be probably taking about 5 weeks to do it, at least, where we will go through and show the major disputes, the good decisions, the bad decisions, the righteous actions, the very much unrighteous actions that have come about as a result of disputes over this particular subject. But because there's been disagreement throughout church history as to both the nature and purpose of artwork or of images of various kinds, doesn't mean that we should shy away from it. It doesn't mean that we should just ignore it. The worst thing you can do with theology or areas of the Bible is just ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist, because when you ignore things, you remain in ignorance willfully, which is not a good position for anyone on any subject, but also you are far more likely to stumble into problems than you are to avoid them. Knowledge, light, order, goodness. That is what brings flourishing, not ignorance, darkness, chaos. So this morning, let me define a couple of terms. There are 2 very important words that come up scripturally. Of course, the word idol, which in Hebrew, pesel, P-E-S-E-L, if you want to transliterate it into English for those who take notes. Pesel is the common word used for idol, and we'll encounter that when we move into the cross-reference in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and the second commandment. Its equivalent, or its Greek equivalent, I should say, is the word eidolon, which is where we get the word idol from in English. Okay, I-D-O-L-O-N, to transliterate into English. So pesel in Hebrew for the Old Testament, eidolon, idol, in the Greek. This is distinct from other words which get used. You have different words for graven or a carved image, so thinking carved as in the form of wood, for example, which is something that a word that we'll be focusing on that comes up a number of times, both in Deuteronomy, this passage here, as well as the reference to 1 Kings chapter 6, which we had during our Old Testament reading earlier in the liturgy. We'll also cross-reference that. And its equivalent is another word in Greek, namely icon, which is where we get the word icon from. So things like iconic. This is where this comes from. And those 2 words are distinct and separate, and it's important for you to understand that, to then follow through the argument that I'm going to be presenting for you here in Scripture. Again, purposefulness, the usefulness, the actual pragmatic functionary components, that's all next week. So again, remember, we're just talking about nature, not function. And if you have 1,000 questions about, well, what are we meant to do with this? Come next week in the next week's lesson. But here this morning, the difference between idol and icon is not just a kind of convoluted ivory tower academic distinction that I'm making. It is, in fact, an actual literary distinction that is made in the scriptures, and I'll demonstrate to you how that's the case, and that'll inform our understanding. So let's have a look in verse 15 here in Deuteronomy chapter 4. So keep your souls very carefully. The same wording we saw last week. That is to say, guard your souls, be on watch, right? Be vigilant with regard to what you believe and what you think, a wise command for any juncture. And in this case, he says, for the purposefulness of, since you did not see any form on the day that Yahweh spoke to you at Horeb, that is Mount Sinai, from the midst of the fire, lest you act corruptly and make a graven image, or in this case, the literal word pesel, an idol, okay? Lest you make for yourself an idol in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female. And it's at this point that he then goes on to give this very plenary kind of phraseology, this all-encompassing command to the people. He continues through by saying, After having said, lest you make anything in the likeness of male and female, verse 17, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the sky, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the waters below the earth. Okay, this is common ancient Near Eastern rhetoric and the ways in which it's describing plenary, meaning all-encompassing terms. Nothing on the earth, right, the creatures, the animals, nothing in the sky, the birds and so on and so forth, nothing beneath the waters, right, the sea creatures. You can see there is on the land, in the air and beneath the sea, there's no room for manoeuvre, so it were. And what Moses is doing here is giving really the most comprehensive exposition, certainly up to this point, but really in all of the Old Testament, of the second commandment. Here he's expositing, he's explaining, he's exegeting the second commandment in consort, of course, with the first. And he begins there in verse 15 with a foundational principle. Again, he's not just kind of rattling off the top of his head, he's establishing fundamental principles and then laying down orders, laying down commands, laying down wisdom based on those fundamental principles. The fundamental principle being that because, in verse 15, you did not see any form of God on the day that God spoke to you, all the Israelites in this case here contextually, at Mount Sinai. Okay, so the fundamental principle as to why the carving of images, or really in this case idolatry, the making of idols, like we saw as we cross-referenced in the very beginning of our series, going back to that unfortunate event with the golden calf, okay, and the creation of what I explained to you there contextually was the Apis bull, the Apis Ankh of Egypt, the cultic sacred bull, mainly worshipped down in Memphis in ancient New Kingdom and Middle Kingdom Egypt, that they had then reverted back to because God had been gone, inverted commas, for 5 minutes. And by that I mean he was talking with Moses. And so the people, of course, unfortunately freak out. They go back to something familiar, namely the false gods, the false idols from which they had just been saved. It involved the creation of, in this case, a statue, so a three-dimensional object, as opposed to two-dimensional, melted down from their various jewelleries that they had possessed, and made into a very familiar figure for them, the Apis bull, a very common imagery. And they went back to not just worshipping this idol as Yahweh, but really going back to the familiarity of the old gods, of the false gods, of the created ones, of a being, in this case a bull, which had been made as opposed to the eternal creator. It's important to remember that fundamental principle. This is why he then says, tying into the nature of who God is by definition, God is spirit, God is spiritual, he is not material as we are, but again, that has an asterisk connected to it, which we'll get to by the time we get to the end of the sermon. Therefore, you are not to portray the divine essence in any material form. Because God created all material things, he is beyond all material things. He is present in and around all things, not in the way that the East believes religiously, but rather he is omnipresent because he is eternal and because he exists beyond time and space itself. You cannot portray in visual or material forms that which is by definition immaterial. Hence this command, especially in the context of idolatry, namely the worship of created things. And it's all tied up in the context of created things. This is exactly what he warns them against, moving through verse 19, if you look with me. This admonition or this warning really is given, verse 19, lest you lift your eyes up to heaven and see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven, that is to say the cosmos or space, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which Yahweh your God has appointed for all the peoples under the whole heaven. Okay, God is the creator of the sun, the moon and the stars. He is the creator of every subatomic particle in existence. He is the creator of the greatest expanses of the universe. At the highest and most magnanimous levels down to the most finite and minute, God has created all things, and he's created them all for a purpose. And that includes the chief of his creation, which is mankind. humanity, who is made in the image of God. And that's a term we're going to come to by the later portions here this morning. Therefore, do not worship them. They have no power to aid you. They have no power to save you. They have no power to bring blessing upon your life. They have no power to guide you in ways that are right and true. Instead, they all act under the sovereign will of God. They all are created for a purpose. In this case, in reference to the sun, the moon, and the stars. They are for the keeping of time and of seasons itself. They are for guidance in navigation, which has been the historic practice and even is in many respects still to this day around the world. They serve a purpose. They testify to the great and infinite grandeur of this one who has created, as far as we may tell at this particular point, potentially hundreds of billions of galaxies with hundreds of billions of stars within each. An almost incomprehensible volume that is but a teardrop in the hand of this God who is infinity. This is their purpose. Therefore, to worship them as if they had any power outside or beyond the maintaining existence and being of the very source and fountain of being who is God is foolishness. It is substituting the infinite for the finite. It is substituting the creator for the created. It is substituting that which is eternal, that which is higher, that which is beyond, for that which is below, that which is finite, that which has death and has an end to it. Apart from the fact that it just seems like a bad trade, it in fact is actually corrosive. It does not bring goodness. It does not bring truth. It does not bring justice. It does not bring righteousness. And instead, as we have seen replete throughout the history of the world, it instead brings darkness. It instead brings chaos. It brings evil. It brings wickedness. It causes man to be, as St. Augustine said some 1500 years ago, in Latin, incurvatus in se, curved in on oneself. It focuses on us and causes us to focus on what is within, what is low, what is down here, quote unquote, as opposed to God, who is above and beyond, yet is also able to be near and dear and present to us. This is the consequences. It's not just merely, oh, I don't like it, says Yahweh, or oh, I find it to be displeasing to me for no particular reason whatsoever. He is warning people throughout time and throughout various places against something that will be not to their benefit, but rather to their harm, to something that will not be to their flourishing, but will rather be, in the end, to their destruction, not only in this life, but in the next. This is the seriousness of it. And again, the actual full nature of idolatry itself and the consequences and all that we'll cover as we move through the rest of this chapter, and then particularly in our exposition on the Ten Commandments in the next chapter, chapter 5. But I want you to keep in mind, as we now move to some of these cross-referential texts, the foundational principle of why this warning is given. Okay, it's in verse 15. I'll repeat it again. Since you did not see any form on the day that Yahweh your God spoke to you at Horeb, or Mount Sinai, from the midst of the fire. Okay, because you didn't see any form, only heard a voice. That's what it says again up in verse 12, which we referenced in the introduction. Yahweh spoke to you from the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the words, but saw no form. That is to say, no material form, no corporeal form. Okay, no flesh and blood, as it were. Only a voice. It's important to remember that. Turn with me over the page or into the next chapter, into chapter 5 for me, which is where Moses repeats the Ten Commandments. It's easier for us to just turn the page than go all the way back to Exodus chapter 20. Herein, again, he's just simply quoting the exact same text. So the text, or the giving here of the Ten Commandments of the Decalogue, is exactly word for word the same as it is in these portions here with regards to Exodus chapter 20. And so Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, this is where the introduction occurs, and then, for our numbering, the first two commands. Verse 6, I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. I am the Creator God. I'm the one who rescued you from your enslavement to the Egyptians in Egypt, as you had been for some 400 plus years. And the slavery, not only to the people, but also to their system, the slavery to false gods, the slavery to the pharaohs, who were the literal embodiment of Horus in ancient Egyptian cultural mythology. And so therefore, upon that basis, the first and second command come. Verse 7, you shall have no other gods before me. That is to say, you shall have no other gods beside me, because I am the only true God. Verse 8, you shall not make for yourself an idol, any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water beneath the earth. Right, this same kind of tripartite, temporal or cosmological view of in the air or the heavens above, on the earth beneath, and in the waters beneath, right, in the seas. This plenary view. But what you have to do is see it in context. This would go for all of the Decalogue, all the 10 Commandments, but again, we'll cover that when we get to it in a couple of weeks' time. But the first command cannot be separated from the second. It should not be done so theologically. Again, you shouldn't separate the first and the second from the third, nor should you do for the fourth. For any of these commands, they cannot just be simply ripped out of context as if they aren't given as a whole set. They all flow for a whole consortium of reasons. This is why Christ himself then goes on to say that the 2 tablets of the law, and in fact the entire law of God, can be summarized in but 2 principles, and they are what? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. That is to say, the first table of the law, the first of the commands, in this case the first 4, are in man's relation to God, and this goes for all people in all places at all times. And then the second table, in this case 5th through 10th, the last 6 commands, are man's relation to man. This is where we see honouring your mother and father, not murdering, not stealing, not lying, so on and so forth. They have to be taken in context. This is why different Christian traditions have had both of these 2 verses, so in this case verse 7 and verse 8, as one and the same command. It's often an area of confusion. So for example, the 2 main Christian traditions that do this is Church of Rome, Roman Catholicism, and Lutheranism, so the Lutheran churches. Both of them, this is just the one command, and often the unfortunate assumption is that those 2, or usually it's only directed at Roman Catholics for a particular reason, is that they delete the second commandment. They get rid of the second commandment to try and justify certain venerative practices, which we'll address next week. Problem is that that's not true, and when you say that, especially to a Roman Catholic, you will end up being shown to be in error. They don't get rid of the command, just like Lutherans don't get rid of the command. It's just simply a different numbering, and many different theologians and the early church fathers also had different numberings. There's still 10, it's just a matter of what is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of it all. But the reason for them taking this as one single command is because theologically they functionally are. They flow one into the other. It's almost as if the theological basis for the second commandment is the first commandment. Because you shall have no other gods before Yahweh, before the one true Creator God, you shall therefore not make for yourself an idol. Does that make sense? You shall not make an idol which is of any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters beneath the earth. It's the context of idolatry, and that kind of harkens into what idolatry is. It's the worship of someone else who is not Yahweh. Very, very simple. But again, we'll explain that more in detail as we move through the book. You have to see that idolatry is inherently connected to the worship of other deities, or elevating other created things to the position or the station of a deity, of a god, and then worshipping it. It's always in connection to that. Same as it is here in Deuteronomy chapter 4, which is our primary passage. It's in the context of the worship of things or people who are not Yahweh. Why does that become important for us here this morning when we're considering the nature of imagery or of artwork in general? It is because of the fact, as we're going to now move through and see a number of other texts that highlight the point I'm making here. These kinds of texts, not only Deuteronomy 4, but also the Decalogue itself and the inherent theological outworking of how that plays out throughout the rest of the scriptures, indicate, I would argue, and many theologians have argued throughout church history rather clearly, that it is not merely the existence of imagery of any kind, full stop, at all. Okay, so it's not a kind of carte blanche or a blanket ban on artwork or imagery or symbolism of any kind whatsoever under any context at all. It is inherently connected to the worship of created things, idols. Okay, here the word idol, which in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, is the word eidolon, idol, distinct from the word icon, or image. Okay, this is where most of your translations into English will use the word image, and we're going to see one of those texts in a little bit. But it is distinct from the concept of any imagery whatsoever. One of the first and most obvious examples in the Old Testament is with the building of the temple itself. Now, this also went for the tabernacle, because the temple was the greater model of the tabernacle. But if you want to turn with me to the passage we had read earlier in the Old Testament, reading earlier in the liturgy, 1 Kings chapter 6, that would be helpful for us. So 1 Kings chapter 6, and what here is being conducted is the commands to the then King Solomon of the United Kingdom of Israel. And here he's being given the commands of how to build this temple in Jerusalem. And we want to pick up particularly and specifically in verse 29. Verse 29 of 1 Kings chapter 6. Then he carved all the walls of the house round about with carved engravings of cherubim, or angels, palm trees and open flowers, from within the inner and outer sanctuaries. And he overlaid the floor of the house with gold in the inner and outer sanctuaries. For the entrance of the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood, the lintel and 5-sided doorposts. So he made 2 doors of olive wood, and he carved on them carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold, and he spread the gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. So also he made for the entrance of the nave 4-sided doorposts of olive wood, and 2 doors of cypress wood, and 2 leaves of one door turned on pivots, and 2 leaves of the other door turned on pivots. And he carved on it also cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and he overlaid them also with gold evenly applied on the engraved work. And he built the inner court with 3 rows of cut stone and row of cedar beams. Now, this passage has begun earlier on in chapter 6. It continues on through chapter 6. I'm highlighting to you the important points. The exact wording and phraseology which we find here in Hebrew, that is to say, with regards to carved images, is exactly the same wording in the Hebrew that we have found back in Deuteronomy chapter 4. The very thing that is being commanded against. So if you have a look in Deuteronomy 4, I'll just remind you, if you've already turned to 1 Kings 6, stay in 1 Kings 6, it's fine, I'll read it back to you. The wording that we get in Deuteronomy 4 is with regards to making anything, verse 16, in a graven image for yourselves in the form of any figure. And certainly as you keep moving through Deuteronomy chapter 4, this wording of carved image, which is just a generic term for literally meaning carved wood, like an actual engraving, is continuously used. Yet here, he is making carved images. He is making engravings in wood, and there's gold. And this is already, by the way, we aren't cross-referencing it here because it's easy to just say it in one sentence. In Exodus chapter 25, you have the creation of the Ark of the Covenant, which has 2 golden watts on it, statues of angels. Okay, 2 golden cherubim. Here, earlier in the passage, when you begin in verse 23, you have the creation of these colossal statues, right, in the literal architectural sense of colossal. They're monumental statues. They're about nearly 18 feet high, about 16 to 18 feet tall, roughly speaking. Big, about 3 times as tall as me. Gigantic statues of cherubim in the temple, right in the heart of the temple. So the question then comes, is God here commanding in this case Solomon and the people of Israel around the 10th century BC, to violate the commands that he gave earlier? No. Is God contradicting himself? No. Is God forgetting what he happened to say to Moses all but a few centuries earlier? No. So the question then comes for us, what on earth is actually going on? If he said, do not make carved images, why is he now commanding carved images to be made? And this ties into this important distinction between idol and icon or image. Okay? The important distinction between what an idol is by function, which is again more next week, and what an image is by function. That is to say, what purpose does it serve? The second commandment has to be interpreted in light of the first, you shall have no other gods before me. Therefore, upon that basis of worship, upon the basis of the honouring and the praying and the singing and so on and so forth, do not make idols. That is to say, other objects, created things, which you then in turn worship as opposed to worshipping God. Are you following? It's always in the context of worship, and that's an important part. And not just worship generically, but actual directed worship, specific worship. When they bowed down, or first having made the Apis bull, the golden calf, and then worshipped it, they were worshipping a different God than Yahweh. They were worshipping a created thing. It was not just merely that they happened to fashion a golden calf and it was kind of just over there. No, the whole purpose for doing it was to bow down and worship it, a familiar cultic image to these recently released slaves. Yes? And so idol is not just merely a category of existence of, this object is an idol by definition. Rather, idolatry is connected to action. Okay, both in thought and deed, but actions nonetheless. There is an intentionality. This is why I've said before in other passages that we've come up to, is that there's no such thing as an accidental idolatry. There's no such thing as accidentally worshipping a false god. There's no such thing as accidentally worshipping or honouring something else other than Yahweh. Okay? There's no secret hidden idolatry where you think you're actually genuinely worshipping Yahweh, but someone's pulled the wool over your eyes in some particular capacity. Not in those kind of simplistic sense, in that simplistic sense. There is no such thing as accidental idolatry. You may be deceived, absolutely. That goes without question. Plenty of people are deceived, and plenty of people go after falsehoods. But that's a whole other category which we'll cover under idolatry. But there is no such thing as accidental idolatry in that literal sense. There is an intentionality about it. There is a direction of the heart, that is to say the will, the mind, in modern parlance, that drives your worship towards something that is created as opposed to the eternal, uncreated God. And understanding that distinction helps us then see what images are by nature. They are much like anything else. That is to say, they are amoral, not immoral, but amoral. They are not good, they are not bad, they simply are. What is the moral value of the woodwork that you see around you? Or of the flooring, or of the ceiling, or of the walls? Nothing. It's not inherently good, it's not inherently bad per se, because moral categories apply to human actions. It is a distinctly anthropomorphic category. It's with regards to the human condition. It's how the images get used. It's how the statues get used. Would the Israelites have been in serious trouble if they had have started bowing down and praying to or through the statues of the cherubim, the angels, in the temple? You bet. Absolutely. Did they do that? No. Sadly and unfortunately, they went to even more blindingly obvious examples, which is just simply adopting Canaanite gods around them, which actually is even worse. But in this particular case, no, they don't. Because they know that this serves a particular purpose. Again, the purpose we'll talk about next week. But it cannot be by definition just the existence. Here, God is commanding them to build not just two-dimensional images, right? Carvings on the wooden doors, or the embroidery in the veil and in the linen work inside the temple, but also actual three-dimensional statues. But for what purpose? Next week. If we move through to the New Testament, I'm going to envelop for you why this is the particular case. I want you to first turn to John chapter 1 with me, please. To give you context, for those who either have never read the passage or who have not read it in a while, the Gospel according to St. John is a very important text that provides eyewitness accounts from someone who knew Jesus as well as pretty much literally anybody else 2,000 years ago. And in these first 18 verses, what we call the prologue of the Gospel of John, here in chapter 1, he provides a deep philosophical exposition of who Jesus is. He's incorporating a familiar Hellenic term, or a Greek concept known as the logos, which means the word. The logos to the Greeks was an impersonal force, so it didn't have personal agency or personhood, but it was the eternal sustaining element that created all the world and upheld all the world, or the cosmos to the Greeks. Here John is explaining that this word, this logos, is actually a person. It's actually identifiable. It's not just an impersonal force like electricity, but instead is actually personal and is in fact God himself. And so he says right at the end, right at the tail end of this prologue here in verse 18, he quotes a very familiar phraseology, one which we've encountered not in the exact same wording but the same concept. No one has seen God at any time. Okay, so no one has seen the divine essence. No one has seen God, who is spirit, okay, because he is immaterial as opposed to material or corporeal. But then immediately makes one of the stunning revelations of the New Testament. Quite frankly, one of the stunning revelations in the history of ancient philosophy. No one has seen God at any time because God is immaterial. Semicolon, continuation of thought, but the only begotten Son, the one and only unique one, the unique God, who is in the bosom of the Father, or who is in union and unison with the Father, he has exegesato. He has made him known. This is actually where we get the word exegesis from, right? In terms of what I'm doing right now. I'm taking a text, I'm exegeting it, I'm drawing meaning out as opposed to reading my meaning into it, and I'm then interpreting, okay? He has exegeted God. He's actually revealed him. He's made him known. You have to see the significance of what John's saying here. He's taking a fundamental principle of worship in the Old Testament. No one has seen God. Therefore, do not make images of him. Do not create other images of created things, which is just as worse, if not even worse, right? Because no one has seen God. And that's fundamentally true. But now, in essence, is what he is saying. Now, the monogenes, the unique God, the unique one, the one of the kind, he has, in reference to Jesus, made God known. He has revealed him now. Because now God has come in the flesh. Now the second person of the Trinity, the Son, relationally, he has now taken on human flesh. He has now become man. He was always God. He is eternally God. There has been no point at which he has not existed. This is not merely a fanciful idea. This is actually a philosophical and logical necessity. It's one which even the ancient Greeks identified. This is Aristotle's unmoved mover, or his prime mover, the one who exists before all things, the one who has created all things, who is the very progenitor of all things, who himself must be uncreated, who himself is, by definition, eternal. Yet in this instance, in order to save his people, in order to redeem the world, he humbled himself and became man for our sake. He became like us, yet was without sin. And this goes on to inform all that we see throughout these historical records of the Gospels, with his death, public, taking upon himself the sins of his people, dying as a sacrifice in our place, appeasing the standards of justice that God righteously and rightfully demands, being buried and then rising from the dead and having over 500 people witness it and see it and spend the rest of their lives not compromising on the truth of what they very publicly saw, of an empty tomb which is there in Jerusalem to this very day, which you can go and visit, you can peek in, you can see, nope, there's no body in there. And no one has ever been able to produce that body because, of course, it turns out that over 500 people were not actually lying. And he did not merely rise spiritually in some esoteric, guric sense, in some ethereal, spiritual manner. No, he rose bodily. He physically rose from the dead because he is God. Because he is the creator of life itself, he is therefore Lord over life and death. He gives and he takes away, and he is more than capable of coming back to life in the body which he himself took upon himself in the first place. And this revealed one, who has now been made man, you no longer, in regards to by the time you get all the way through his life, hundreds of thousands of people who heard and saw Jesus walk and talk and speak and do all kinds of miraculous, supernatural, as we may say in modern parlance, things which are reliably recorded for us, which are even recorded for us by the enemies of Jesus, both Jewish and Roman. They no longer just heard a voice. They now felt the touch. They now saw with their eyes form. The incarnation of God changed everything. And that goes for a whole replete list of things theologically. But in this specific case that we're addressing here, it goes with regards to worship. You have to see what John's doing. He has formulated and constructed that punchline of his prologue so specifically, so cleverly, so brilliantly, quite frankly, that it's impossible really to miss. No one has seen God. Common phraseology from the Old Testament. In brackets, parentheses, but now. The only unique God. The second person, Jesus Christ. He's unique because now he's come in the flesh. He has revealed God to us. This is why the Apostle Paul, in his famous hymn, the Colossian hymn as we often refer to it, in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20, begins by saying that he, Christ, is the image of the invisible God. That word image, the Greek word icon. He is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is quite literally the icon of God, the image of God. He has revealed him. You only ever heard a voice in the Old Testament, powerful, awe-inspiring, terror-inducing, with the roars of thunder and with the power of 1,000 waves, but a voice nonetheless. Yet now, this same booming voice which you heard in the Old Testament had now come in the flesh, and you could see God. You could walk with God, talk with God. God would now place a hand of comfort upon your shoulder in times of need. God would now pick up a whip and drive out evil from God's house. He now has form, and he still has form to this day. He rose bodily, he ascended bodily, he is enthroned in universal majesty and dominion over all things bodily. The crown that sits upon his head sits upon a head of bone and of flesh. He is enthroned bodily. And therefore he has revealed God. And we read of this revelation of the great power that is the incarnation. What we will be celebrating as we do in custom here through Advent, the 4 weeks leading up to the blessed and holy season of Christmas. He is the image, the icon of the invisible God. And that is why, to turn back to John chapter 14, which comes later, the words of Christ that come to us in verses 7 and 8 of John chapter 14. If you have come to know me, says Christ, you will know my Father also. From now on, you know him and have seen him. Philip, confused, not quite getting the point yet, as the disciples were in the habit of at this particular juncture, said to the Lord, Lord, show us God, and it is enough for us. Show us the Father, and it's enough for us. Not understanding the words that just came out of Christ's mouth, Jesus replies in verse 9, have I been with you all so long, and yet you have not come to know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. He who has seen me has seen God. This has implications, as I mentioned earlier, I believe, for all manners of areas of Christian life and practice, Christian doctrine and action and belief. But in this specific respect, with regards to the nature of imagery, to the nature of what we'll just in a general broad term call Christian art, everything from two-dimensional art to three-dimensional art to the children's book about Moses in the Exodus, so on and so forth, to a cartoon, to animated films like The Prince of Egypt from DreamWorks back in the 90s. All these kinds of things. Even more broadly, architecture. The implications that these verses have are fundamental. The concern that many Christians have had have usually fallen into two camps, and I'll explain them to you. It's shockingly more complex than this. Please appreciate the nature of that. I'm trying to boil this down to as simple form as I can. On the one hand, particularly among most Protestants, not all, but most Protestants, and some figures in the early church, not all, but some figures, including important ones, the concern has been for a violation of the second commandment. A very noble reason. Anyone who is desiring not to violate the second command, I'm not going to falter for their intention. It's a desire to uphold the wording of not making any carved image or any image in this case at all, under any circumstances, because of this kind of plenary nature, nothing in the heavens above or on the earth below or on the waters beneath. And this is taken as a very plenary statement, and it is plenary. The question then comes plenary and all-encompassing in what particular context? What particular context? And namely that you can't separate the second from the first, which is the worship of God, or in this case of the first commandment, the warning against the worship of things or people or beings that are not God. The context of idolatry is in the worship of things who are not Yahweh, and in giving them prayers, giving them your hymns, giving them your service, right? All the various things which idolatry is by definition, which we will cover later in this series. On the other side, the concern is for not denying the incarnation of Christ. The counter-argument, which also holds considerable biblical weight, just as this former one does, is that by rejecting the creation of artwork, say a stained glass window, for example, that depicts a scene from the Gospels, right? Something simple, that to not portray the incarnate Christ, right, the incarnate Son of God, Jesus, is erring or bordering on the side of denying the humanity of Christ, that he is only spirit, therefore we cannot portray him. Right? Not betray, but portray. And the concern there is not to fall into Nestorianism, which is an ancient heresy we've referenced in whenever it's come up. But Nestorianism is the belief that not only is Jesus have two natures, fully God and fully man, but that he actually has two persons, that he is both a divine person and a human person. And this creates a whole bunch of problems, apart from the fact that the scriptures go to great length to dispel that concept. This was unfortunately a belief that a number of people fell into, particularly by the 4th century and then into the 5th century AD, ironically actually trying to avoid a whole different heresy called Apollinarianism. There was a gigantic pendulum swing that resulted in just as much of an issue. But the concept that Jesus is only able to be portrayed as divine or spiritual, therefore immaterial, is a problem. That's what the Gnostics believe. Right, we've covered that in our church history series when you've got into Justin Martyr, who did a lot of work against the Gnostics, as with Irenaeus of Lyon. That Jesus is only divine, he's only spiritual. Therefore, he didn't physically rise from the dead, he spiritually rose from the dead. These kinds of problematic concepts. What I'm trying to indicate to you is that Christians have lined up on these different issues not because they just have such an overwhelming desire to worship pagan gods, no, but rather because both sides actually have very profound biblical reasons for doing so, both of which have equally profound consequences. One side trying to avoid a second commandment violation, good, right? I'm glad you're trying to avoid that. The other side trying to avoid Nestorianism and a denial of the incarnation and the world-changing impact that has had. Also thumbs up good intentions. And so what really should be required is much more charity than is often given in these discussions. Often we tend to view as Protestants the Roman Catholic architecture or the Eastern Orthodox artwork and imagery, forgetting the practice for a sec because that's next week, but just the mere existence of such things, forgetting how they're used, just the existence, and we have a naturally reflexive posture. Now that usually comes because of the praxis, that is to say the practice around which those things are used. But we should not, I would submit in wisdom, throw out the baby with the bathwater. Because even the reformers themselves lined up on different sides of this particular equation. There were those who rightfully, and this is particularly the continental reformed, so Swiss reformed, Dutch reformed, the Scottish Reformation, so John Knox and the Presbyterians, for example. Congregationalists, Baptists come down this same side as well, generally speaking, which is trying to avoid a second commandment violation. Okay? Well-intentioned and pat on the back for being careful about that. The question is, in what context is the second commandment given? And how is imagery to be used? Because what I would try to submit to you is that this morning we have seen that God is not schizophrenic. God is not contradictory. God is not double-minded. He is not senile and forgetful of what he happened to say. He told them to not create any carved images which would be used as idols. In the case of the literal term pesel in the Hebrew, idol. Do not create idols. And that is the wording of the second commandment. It is not just a generic carved imagery. That's a whole different phrase in Hebrew. It is specifically pesel. Do not create for yourselves pesel, idols, or in Greek, eidolon. Yet he then goes on to command the entire elaborate construction of this resplendent temple, which was the envy of many in the ancient world at that time. There was no more beautiful and magnanimous a building in the world, and non-Israelite sources say as much. And it is filled with carvings of both inanimate objects, palm leaves and other such symbols, and animate beings, angels, on the doors, the walls, the curtains, the tapestry, actual statues themselves, all the way into the Holy of Holies on the Ark of the Covenant. Why? Because imagery itself, art, is not inherently evil. It is not inherently idolatrous. It's not inherently bad or corrupt. Ironically, to mention one of the groups I talked about earlier, that's exactly what the Gnostics believed. Down here, material world, corrupt, evil, bad, get rid of it. We have to escape to this Platonic realm of ideal. This is what the Epicureans and the Stoics believed, and the other various Neoplatonic groups that came after them believed, which we've talked about many times before. We need to escape for the higher spiritual things. This is why when the Apostle Paul is speaking at the Agora, and in this case the Areopagos in Athens, his deep theological, metaphysical, philosophical, historical speech is drawing the attention of the greatest minds in Athens in that day, right up until he mentions what? The resurrection. being raised back into the corporeal, material, physical world, at which they check out and exit stage left. Because the concept of being raised into the material, no, it's corrupt and bad and evil. We need to escape it for the purely spiritual things, the higher ideals which Plato and Zeno led us into. Material is not bad. This world in which you exist is not inherently evil in itself. It is corrupted by the evil of the human mind and of the human will. The problem with Canaan, we've spelt this out before as we've been going through the conquests of the Amorite kingdoms at thus far east side of the Jordan, as they prepared across the Jordan and head west. The inherent problem with Canaan was not the land. The inherent problem with Canaan was what? The Canaanites. It is man that corrupted the land, not the other way round. The Canaanites were not especially and particularly evil, which they were even contextually at that time in the second millennium BC, because of something to do with the land. No, they had abandoned God to a far greater degree than even their other pagan neighbours had, and they are the ones who plagued and cursed the land. The land was inherently good. The land was, as God said to Abraham, a land of milk and honey. Right, a beautiful and blessed land, because it is the land which God looked upon having created it and said, it is very good, especially after having created his image bearers, us. We've allowed these kinds of views to seep in many, many ways. We've identified some of them as we've gone through Deuteronomy, and no doubt we will identify more of them as we continue to go through. But we've adopted these kinds of concepts, even to ways and in degrees that we may not immediately realise, where this life down here kind of sucks, it's hard and difficult, and everything will be better though when we die and get to heaven. Now, apart from the fact that our presence with Christ is a good and blessed hope, and neither I nor anyone that I know is denying that reality, that is not to be forsaken with regards to both the inherent goodness of God's created order and our mission within God's good and created order. And that goes also for art itself. I will unpack that in far more detail next week, but the point I leave you with is this. God is indeed spirit, and to portray the divine nature in and of itself is not just merely a bad idea, it is impossible. No images of the Father should ever be made because the Father is not corporeal. No images of the Holy Spirit should ever be made because he is not corporeal. Neither of those two persons took on human flesh. This is why I would have problems with, for example, the creazione di Adamo, the creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. As beautiful of a painting and a fresco as it is, it creates a whole host of problems, apart from the fact that God is portrayed as Unitarian. There's only one figure, which already opens up a whole can of worms. He is also portrayed corporeally, which is a difficult one to justify theologically. So I'm not advocating for images of the Trinity, as if you could just have three men standing side by side. No, you cannot do that, and definitely do not do that. Not because this command that no one has seen God in spirit, in the invisible, immaterial sense, not because that's changed. No, God has not changed. Nor has the divine nature of Christ changed. But he has added, he has taken onto himself human nature. Both sides of this debate have good reason for doing so. If you are asking me personally, where do I line up as a pastor and as a theologian, I do line up in the latter category. Whilst I do deeply appreciate the desire to not violate the second commandment, and I very much applaud people for wanting to do that, I'm glad that you want to not violate the second commandment as opposed to looking for excuses to do it. But I do think that it takes the second commandment out of context, which is namely in connection to the first, the worship of things who are not God. More on that next week. And then fails to incorporate what the New Testament reveals about the substance of these very issues, like we saw in very direct terms in John's prologue. No one has seen God, but now, parentheses, the only unique God, the Son of God, the second person, who is in the bosom, who's in the faithfulness and the care of the Father, he has made him known. Because, as Paul says, he is the image, the icon of the invisible God, And therefore, as Jesus himself goes on to say, if you have seen me, not just merely heard me, if you have seen me, physical, material, corporeal, if you have seen me, you have seen God. You have seen the Father. And I'm concerned with denying the reality, the world-altering reality of the incarnation. Because man has now seen God, and that matters. Because man has not just merely seen God come and walk and talk and live among us, but man has seen God die for man. Man has seen God buried for man. Man has seen God rise from the dead, ascend in all glory, and be enthroned in universal majesty and dominion for man. And the portrayal of that reality as a representation, I would argue, is permissible. I would argue is actually a good thing. Let alone anyone else who is not Christ. Let alone any of the early church fathers or of the saints or of any of the figures we might talk, or of biblical scenes which themselves are human and at that point really are no different than you having a photo of your family and loved ones on the wall. But more next week with how they get used, because it's not just carte blanche, and I'm not just saying carte blanche and just go ahead and do whatever you want with them. No, if you have questions along those lines, you need to come next week or listen to next week's video, which will then be up on our YouTube channel, okay? I'm more than welcome to questions after the sermon, but I leave you with this exhortation. The incarnation of Christ changed everything. And it is the axis upon which time and history revolves. Amen.